Chapter 5. His heart pounding, Barry followed Louise through the hallway and into the living room. It was worse than he had dared imagine. The furniture had been thrown over, the empty wine bottles smashed, the drawers and cupboards opened, and their contents vomited over the carpet. Claw marks were gouged into the walls, deep grooves through the wallpaper and into the plaster. For the tiniest of moments, Barry knew that there was something he should do, but couldn't remember what it was. And then it hit him. Louise's mother, creature of habit that she was, would have left some sort of message. He bolted into the kitchen and skidded to a halt in front of the freezer, where little multicolored magnets shaped like fish sandwiched all manner of notes and lists between them and the white metal surface. And there it was, a square of white paper with copybook handwriting in red biro. Louise, your father isn't feeling well, so I've taken Cassie home for the night. Phone you tomorrow morning. Love, Mum. Lou! He yelled, running into the living room, and then, seeing it empty, bounding up the stairs 2 at a time towards Cassie's bedroom. He found Louise sobbing on the landing, her hand squeezing the door handle so that her knuckles were white. I can't go in, she managed to say. It's all right, Lou, it's all right. He held the piece of paper up. Cassie's at your mum's. She sighed, and then started coughing. Barry gave her a soft pat on the back and made reassuring noises, but her elation didn't last long. What about Mum? What if they've gone to her house? As she started to panic, the phone rang downstairs. Vaulting the stairs 3 at a time, Barry stopped in the doorway to the living room and tried to locate the source of the sound. Whatever had thrown a wobbly in there hadn't been too particular as to where it had left anything. He found the socket and followed the wire behind the sofa and under a blue throw cushion, and then picked up the receiver. Hello? Oh, Mrs. Mason? Yes, I'll just go and get her. Anne tried to sleep, but it hovered too far out of reach to embrace. Instead, her mind leapt and swooped around the day's events with a randomness and distortion that was addictive. The doctor, the library, Ashley Chapel, and there, like a black cloud descending with the wrath of ancient gods, was the great intelligence. But she knew its name, and names were power over spirits and demons and devils like Yog-Sothoth. Just saying the name was a calming mantra, as she repeated it, relishing the control that she now possessed. And soon she was able to embrace sleep, her final thoughts aimed at the next midnight, the millennium. She would stop Chapel now, at last. Barry came back into the living room carrying 2 mugs of very strong coffee, just as Louise put the phone down. And how was your charming mother? He asked, handing her the blue mug. More parental guidance? Don't be so nasty. At least I know Cassie's safe, and Mum won't answer the door at this time of night. Tell me about it. He could easily bring to mind the night when she had forgotten her key. He had hidden behind the hedge as Louise had tried to get her mother to open the front door, but to no avail. The following day, her mother had explained, in the middle of interrogating Louise as to her whereabouts the previous night, that she never answered the door after 10:30 because of what had happened to Mrs. Keeble 2 doors down with the flasher. So what do we do now? He asked. We should call the police. She blew on the coffee to cool it. What's going on, Barry? How did Derek turn into that thing? He stared into the swirling coffee. It's Chapel. Derek admitted as much. And it was Chapel's work that wrecked your computer, wasn't it? Unless insides turning into blue silk is a known bug in the computer industry. He sighed. You saw what Derek had turned into. The same color, the same gold and silver. He was working for Chapel, Lou. He admitted it. She pondered, and then nodded. You're right. But what is Chapel doing? Something evil. Evil? She repeated. Aren't you overreacting a bit? Am I? When I looked into the eyes of what was left of Derek, well, that's what I saw. Evil. He put down the coffee mug with a thump. You're right. We've got to go to the police, and then tomorrow we go to Chapel and get him to explain. What? Snapped Louise. You stole part of his research project, remember? And it's gone a bit beyond petty theft. James is dead, and there's a bloodthirsty demon skulking around London. We're in over our heads, Barry. And even if we do go to the police, what are we going to tell them? Barry grabbed her hands. "Don't worry. I'll have thought of something by the time we get to the station." He reached over and grabbed the phone. "I'll order a taxi." "The police station?" He shook his head. "First stop, my flat. I fancy a shower and a stiff drink before facing Her Majesty's Constabulary." 1 hour after opening the file, Mel was pretty sure that she understood the peculiar language that the CV-34 program, if that's what it actually was written in. Having read the 6,000 lines of code in the first 10 minutes, she had then taken out a pad of paper and a propelling pencil from her handbag and proceeded to jot down random impressions as both sides of her brain went into overdrive. 20 sheets of mind maps and logic matrices later, she was able to write her first few lines of code. Half an hour later, she spotted something in the program that concerned her. Everything in her logically deduced model of Chapel's language held together in a perfectly self-consistent way. This indicated that she had got it right. But if that was true, what she was seeing in CV-34 was a bug. She returned her attention to the pad next to her and began copying out the lines that she suspected of being in error. It struck her immediately. There was a minor syntax error, an absent exclamation mark. For a second, she pondered the wisdom of interfering, and then she decided that it wouldn't take a second to put it right, and it could be considered a sort of compensation to Chapel for her unlawful entry. With a decisive prod at the keyboard, she added the punctuation mark. And then she spotted another error. Within minutes, she was totally engrossed in debugging. "She corrected the syntax," whispered Chapel in tones of near reverence, and then his voice snapped back to normal. "Assuming that Ms. Bush had never encountered the Codex language before this evening, then her ability to spot an error in a piece of our code in less than an hour is nothing short of genius. At this rate, she'll debug the entire Millennium Codex in less than 5 hours." He poured himself another cup of coffee from his silver cafetiere. "Perhaps we should give our research teams tomorrow off." He looked at his watch. "By tomorrow, I really mean today, of course." He turned to Harker. "I intend to follow the progress of bright Ms. Bush, David, but you appear to be surplus to requirements. Why don't you get a few hours' sleep? We've got a busy day ahead of us." Harker knew that a few hours' sleep didn't mean a trip home. Not that that mattered much anymore. It meant an uncomfortable night in his office, tossing and turning on the fold-up bed that he kept in a cupboard for such situations. But it was a respite from Chapel, and that was exactly what he needed at the moment. He held up his hand to say good-night, but Chapel didn't even see him leave. Chapel was too preoccupied with the way that Miss Bush was optimizing one of the sort routines. At a rough guess, she had just increased its sort rate by 500%. He scratched his nose and wondered how long it would have taken to complete the codex with a team of Mels, even one Mel, to help him. The 7th of May, 1994, he decided, settling down to his own version of breakfast television with a pot of hot coffee. Barry wandered blindly into the living room of his flat, his vision obscured by the towel that hung down over his face as he dried his hair. Throwing the towel over his shoulder, where it expertly wrapped itself around the back of a chair, he grabbed the brandy bottle and poured himself an extremely generous measure. He was a lager drinker by preference, but he'd bought the brandy for some recipe or other that he had once wanted to try. It certainly wasn't Remy Martin, but it was drinkable. Then again, he reflected, after this evening's experiences, he would have settled for a bottle of meths and a straw. Louise was curled up in the corner of one of the 2 blue 2-seater sofas, a large brandy glass cradled in her left hand, the drink swishing from side to side. Engulfed in the spare, toweling dressing gown, she looked calm and relaxed, but this cool demeanor was betrayed by the overflowing contents of the ashtray next to her. Even as Barry watched, she lit another cigarette and drew on it. "Are the windows locked?" Barry couldn't help laughing. "Yes, Lou. The windows and the front door. Besides, our Derek Demon would have to know where to look." She stubbed out the half-smoked cigarette. "If we're up against Chapel—" "Which is a fairly safe bet," he interrupted. Louise wasn't impressed. She continued, stressing each word. "If we're up against Chapel, he knows where to find all of us from our personnel files." "Not me," he objected, winking as he did so. "Sorry?" Barry sipped his brandy. "Not me. When I moved from the flat in Putney, I never bothered to let ACL know. That's against company procedures. She ground to a halt as she realized how ludicrous that sounded. Why did you do that? To Barry, it had been obvious, but his particular work ethic wasn't one widely shared by the rest of ACL. Work was work, and home is home. As you, as well as every manager I've ever had, knows full well when I come home, that's it. Look at John Greenstreet. In the office till 8 every night, working weekends, putting ACL first every time. And becoming the youngest manager in the company, Louise pointed out, lighting 2 cigarettes and passing one to Barry. Seems like a pretty good trade-off to me, she puffed. Before he was made redundant like the rest of us, countered Barry smugly. At the end of the day, none of it made the slightest difference. To us, to Greenstreet. But it did to James, he added quietly. That's what I don't understand, said Louise. Where does James fit into it all? You stole a floptical and I'm guilty by association, but poor old James. How did he get tangled up in all this? She trailed off, before staring at Barry with a mixture of horror and anger. Of course! It was his floptical! She scrambled to her feet, knocking the ashtray and spraying dog ends over the Paisley sofa. You bastard! You absolute bastard! James is dead because of you! There's some demon out there who wants to kill us! Kill James! Kill Cassie! She tried to punch him, but the attack was sufficiently telegraphed for Barry to grab her wrist. Please, Lou, calm down. He gently sat her down onto the sofa. Do you really think I would have put all our lives at risk if I'd known what it would lead to? I took the floptical from James's desk because he was stupid enough to leave it in plain sight, and I was curious. You know how strict Chapel normally is about security. There's one hell of a difference between a written warning and having your neck broken by a demon, Barry, said Louise quietly. I know, he agreed. But you must believe me. She placed her hand on his. I do. I know you wouldn't do anything to hurt me or Cassie. It's just difficult to think rationally. Demons, computers turning into windows into hell. She shook her head. For God's sake, Barry, the world just doesn't work like that. He squeezed her hand in an attempt at reassurance. It does now. Let me see if I've got this straight, growled the policeman, a blond man with a cleft chin and halitosis. You arrived at Mr. Campling's house about an hour ago, about midnight, and found the front door wide open. Louise shook her head. Not wide open, just open. Over another brandy, she and Barry had hammered out their story, agreeing on the points and details that they needed to convince the police to investigate. The events of earlier that night, specifically the presence of a blue-black demon that had once been a colleague from ACL, had been, well, altered. Louise just hoped that their mutual story was both believable and, just as importantly, consistent. And the interior of the house suggested a struggle of some sort? The policeman chewed the end of his biro. The phone table had been knocked over. Very conclusive. Mr. Brown, said the policeman sarcastically. Ever thought of a career in the force? Barry stepped closer to the desk. PC Chapman. We came here because we were worried about our friend. Louise suppressed a shudder, knowing that James Campling would never have to worry about anything ever again. There's no need to be funny about it. Chapman shot Barry a look of disdain, but his tone was much more sympathetic as he continued. At this point, you and Miss Mason came straight here. Didn't you think about going in? No, officer, Barry replied wearily. Believe it or not, we were frightened. What if the person responsible was still inside? I see your point. Mr. Brown. Chapman picked up the sheet of paper from the desk and thumbed towards the door behind him. I'll just go and have a word with my superiors and be right back. Take a seat in the waiting room. With that, he was gone. Well? Asked Louise as she sat down on one of the plastic chairs. What do you think? Barry shrugged. We've done our best. But what about Derek? She hissed, the memory of his transformation vivid in her mind. He could still be out there. The thought of that monster somehow finding her mother's house and threatening Cassie was more than she could bear. Barry grabbed her hand and squeezed, a gesture of both support and of silence. For Christ's sake, Lou, what are we supposed to do? You saw what that little tosser was like. If I'd started going on about demons, he would have thrown us out. She reached into her bag and withdrew a crushed packet of Benson and Hedges. Cigarette? He pulled one from the packet and straightened it, and then lit it as Louise proffered the flame from her lighter. "Thanks," he said through the blue cloud. "At least this way someone can deal with James's body, can't they?" "But it leaves Chapel in the clear, Barry." "I know," he said imploringly, "but I don't know what else to do." They both fell into an awkward silence, and Louise passed the time by reading the trite and patronizing posters that covered the walls. After what seemed like hours, a cough from the desk drew their attention. P.C. Chapman had returned, and his expression didn't give Louise a particularly warm feeling. "Mr. Brown, Miss Mason?" They stood up and walked over to the desk, both holding their latest cigarettes behind their backs, like naughty schoolchildren caught behind the bike sheds. Chapman also stood with his hands behind his back, but this was probably his attempt to appear the perfect Bobby. "The area car took a look at Mr. Campling's house," he stated. "And," urged Barry. Louise knew that Barry hated it when people said things for effect, holding back the real information because it gave them a sense of power. It was one of the reasons why he had been such a lousy player in the game of office politics. "And Mr. Brown," continued the policeman with spiteful relish. "There was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. The front door was closed." "But the hallway," protested Barry, "because of your concerns. Mr. Brown, P.C.'s Ventnor and Daffin entered the house." Louise could feel his disdain. "And everything was in perfect order, including," and the sarcasm simply dripped off this bit, "including the hall. A nice tidy hall with a nice and tidy and upright phone table. There was no sign of Mr. Campling." "Surely that should tell you something, officer?" "Not exactly, no." Chapman slid a piece of paper out from beneath the statement and waved it in front of them. "Do you know what this is?" Louise tried to make it out. It was a computer printout of some sort, but the precise words evaded her. "No? Then I'll enlighten you. It's an email message from a Mr. James Richard Campling of 51 Aspley Road, Chelsea, informing his local police station that he will be on holiday as of Thursday the 30th of December, and asking whether we could keep an eye on his house while he's sunning himself in Lanzarote." He crumpled the message in his fist before slamming it on the counter. "And yet you claim that his front door was wide open, and the hallway wrecked." He glared belligerently. "Is this some kind of joke?" Louise froze. Sending a message from Campling's email address would be child's play to someone of Chapel's genius, and this was clear proof that Chapel was one step in front of them. She could see the panic in Barry's face. She could feel the cogs turning in his mind as he tried to come up with another convincing story. "But," he began. His objections were cut short when Louise wrapped her arm round his and dragged him out of the police station, leaving an irate P.C. Chapman open-mouthed. "What are you doing, woman?" he shouted as they pushed through the double doors. "Saving our necks!" She grabbed and lit another cigarette to replace the one that she had dropped in the station. "If you hadn't noticed, Barry, we've been stitched up. Stitched up perfectly. Chapel knows exactly what we're doing, and he's not going to let us get away." She took a long drag on the cigarette. Barry plonked himself on the low wall which surrounded the police station and rubbed his face with his hands. "So what now?" "We go back to your place and get a good night's sleep. I think we deserve it." "And what then?" Louise shrugged. "I can only think of one option left. We go and see Chapel." Barry stared at her. "What? But that's madness," she smiled. "I know. That's why I want to sleep on it." The doctor opened his eyes, and then shut them immediately to keep out the onslaught of light and sound. His most recent memories were disjointed and confused, as if someone had scrambled his synapses. He jumped to his feet and placed his hands on his hips, breathing deeply as he reorientated himself. The TARDIS sounded in perfect health. To his companions, there was never anything more than a soothing hum, but he was well aware of the choir of harmonies and melodies it contained, a language all of its own. And one glance at the console was enough for the doctor to assure himself that the ship wasn't under attack. Whatever had happened, it was gone now, leaving nothing more than a jumble of names and images. But one name suddenly bobbed to the surface: Anne Travers. And that particular train of thought concluded in the appointment they had at Canary Wharf Tower at 11 the next morning. This morning, he corrected, noting from one of the readouts that it was already 8 o'clock, and Mel had been out all night. Harker groaned as a bird-like warble impinged upon his dreams. For one delicious moment he imagined it to be coming through the French windows from the garden. He was chewing on a slice of toast, while the kids were arguing over which channel to watch, The Incredible Death Ghouls or Jolly Jack. And Jean was just waiting for the last drops of fresh coffee to drip through the filter. Then the bird song deepened and became the doorbell. Harker got up from the breakfast bar and walked towards the front door, ignoring Jean and Jamie and Edward and their pleas for him to stay. But he had to answer the door, and it was Chapel, and he followed him, and the house wasn't there anymore. He gave a dry shout and sat upright, realizing that he was in his office and the warbling was his phone. And Jean and the boys were long gone, his family one of the many sacrifices he had made for the man who was now demanding his presence like a king summoning his courtiers. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and wondered whether it had all been worth it. And then he thought about Chapel's special New Year's party and smiled. Oh yes, it would all be worth it in the end. He picked up his telephone. "Ah, David." Chapel sounded like he had just eaten a hearty breakfast after a good night's sleep, rather than having spent the night in front of a tablet. "I hope you slept well." Before Harker could reply, Chapel continued, "I'd like you to pay the university a visit." The university? Chapel's visions of grandeur were getting worse. Harker was now at the level of a gopher or an office boy, it seemed. "Yes, the university library, to be precise. I want to borrow someone, and when you've done that, we'll be ready to compile the codex again." As Marker pulled on his suit trousers, he was forced to protest. "But we ran a compilation last night. Why should this one be any different?" He suddenly understood. "That Bush woman?" "Quite, so just run along and get her," Harker growled. Soon, so very soon, Chapel would be sorry for treating him like a servant. Extremely sorry. Comforted by warm thoughts of rebellion, Harker started tying up his shoelaces. From the age of 13, Melanie Bush had realized the importance of a healthy body. Much to the chagrin of her parents, she had embraced the doctrine of vegetarianism, forcing her mother to provide her with wholesome meals that didn't depend on animal flesh. At the same time, tea and coffee had become anathema. Herbal drinks only, if you please. Had she drunk coffee, she might not have fallen asleep over the library's computer. And she might have finished her investigations and returned to the TARDIS without any problems. This was not to be the case. Slumped over the tablet, Mel was completely unaware of the large shadow which fell over her, and completely unprepared for the bear-like paw that clamped itself on her shoulder. "Melanie Bush!" The growling inquiry was enough to wake her. The looming presence was more than enough to scare the hell out of her. "What do you want?" she shrieked, making a futile attempt to squirm free. The man was massive and grey, with a voice that was deep and extremely threatening. Mel knew immediately that she had no choice but to follow his instructions. "What do you want?" she repeated. And then she realized that she recognized him. "David Harker?" He pulled up the chair from the next terminal and sat down. He stroked his chin and stared at her, a look more of analysis than any kind of threat. Finally he spoke. "You're a very intelligent young woman, Melanie. Very intelligent." He reached over and swiveled her tablet screen round to face him. He obviously recognized the particular module. His eyebrows shot up. "The C-ASIC routine. Have you debugged that one as well?" She remained silent, suddenly aware of the copy of Glaus next to the tablet. Harker also became suddenly aware and picked the book up, releasing a hacking laugh at the pneumatic blonde adorning the cover. His humor rapidly evaporated, however, when he scanned the indicia a couple of pages in. Mel knew why. Copyright 2023 was enough to make even a seasoned time traveler like herself do a double-take. Rather than ask about the book, Harker took the easy option. He replaced the book on the table and repeated his earlier question. This time, however, Mel decided that honesty was the best policy. Harker obviously knew what she'd been up to all night, and because of his connection with ACL, Ashley Chapel probably did as well. "No, I haven't. I fell asleep. I'm afraid." "Shame," he muttered. "That module has been a pain in the arse since the beginning. I was hoping that you'd spare me the trouble of sorting it out." He must have noticed Mel's quizzical look, because he elaborated. "I'm the head of development at ACL, remember? And you've been making my life one hell of a lot easier, Miss Bush, in more ways than one. He picked up the piece of paper creased up next to Glaus and held it up like a little flag. You have me to thank for these protocols. I asked Julia Prince to pass them on to you. At Mel's frown, he continued. I'm also responsible for the lot working here, including Julia. You? Exclaimed Mel, and then realized the significance of his words. But why do you want to hack into your own computers? It doesn't make sense. She eyed him suspiciously. You're up to something, aren't you? And I doubt that Ashley Chappell knows about it, does he? He stood up and indicated for her to do the same. Now, Melanie, we're off for a little drive. He started walking towards the doors out of the still busy library. And then he stopped and frowned. I think you need a bit of education.